You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, this is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I want to welcome you to this week's SLA Insight. We're continuing a conversation that we began several weeks ago about comprehensible input, the importance of input in language acquisition, and we've been focusing more recently on increasing the quality of input, providing input that is going to promote acquisition most efficiently. And so we're looking at things like, how do we work with the limited working memory that each of us has? What do we do about default processing strategies, and how do we work against those that are less efficient? So the last couple episodes, I've been talking about processing instruction and how that is not a method, but it is an intervention, one tool that you might have to create input that is going to be helpful for your students. And so the last couple of weeks I've talked about, on a more theoretical basis, what are some of these default processing strategies that each of us has when we come to learning a language. And so now today I'm going to be looking a little more practically in terms of how do we create activities that will promote acquisition using this processing instruction. Now, just as a quick review, processing instruction has three key components. One is explicit grammar information, where you actually explain straight out what's the form, how does it work. The second is providing your students with information about those processing strategies. And again, the last couple episodes, I went over those, what those are and how they work. So today we're focusing on the actual activities themselves, which is by far the most important component of processing instruction. And in fact, some of the empirical research that's been done is that you could almost leave out the first two. As long as you have the structured input activities, the students are going to be gaining from that. Now, these activities are specifically designed to move students away from their inefficient processing strategies, their defaults. And to do so, they need to follow some very, very specific guidelines. So what I'm going to do today is to run through the list of guidelines quickly and then go back and focus in on the first one. And then next week, I'll focus on the second, and so on, giving some examples and so on of how you make these work. So with that, the 6 guidelines that you need to follow for structured input have been expounded upon by Andrew Farley. He has a book called Structured Input, Grammar Instruction for the Acquisition-Oriented Classroom, published in 2005. And these are the 6 guidelines that you need to follow if you're going to create these structured input activities. 1, you want to present one thing at a time. 2, keep meaning in focus. 3, move from sentences to connected discourse. 4, use both oral and written input. 5, make sure the learners are doing something with the input. And 6, keep the learner's processing strategies in mind. So, as I said earlier, I'm just going to focus today on the first guideline, that is, present one thing at a time. And what they mean by that, Van Patten, Farley, Cadierno, the ones who developed processing instruction, they're saying only one new vocabulary item, or even one new aspect of a complex vocabulary item, or one new form. And that means not just one new paradigm, but one piece of the paradigm, not the whole paradigm. One new syntactical structure. It also means if you are introducing, for example, one new vocabulary item, then don't go and introduce new grammar at the same time, and vice versa. And really what we're getting back to is Creation's I+1, the input hypothesis, that you need input that is only 1 degree more difficult than the level where you're currently at, in order to most efficiently acquire the language. So right along those lines, those who have developed structured input processing instruction are saying only introduce one thing at a time. So I told you I'm going to go more practical today. What does that look like on a day-to-day basis? So a few examples here. First, if we're going to think about from Hebrew, for example, a vocabulary item like tachat, its basic meaning is under, but it can also mean in place of. If you're going to introduce that vocabulary, you want to introduce the two separate meanings independently, one at a time. So start with under, that seems to be the more basic one, but don't confuse it with in place of at the same time. Introduce that separately, a different day, a different section of your learning time. Another example, if we're talking grammar, introduce, as I said earlier, not the whole paradigm at once, but just one piece of the paradigm. So if you're teaching Greek grammar and you want to introduce the present active indicative, you're not going to make them work with the entire paradigm all at once. Don't ask them to memorize the paradigm. Don't create assignments that are using all the forms in the paradigm. Now, let me clarify. You can show them the whole paradigm if you'd like, and certain analytical learners are going to need that. They're going to want to see the big picture and where that new form fits in that big picture. And that's fine, but don't go creating activities that include all of the forms. Use one form at a time. So, for example, you might want to focus on the third person singular. Get that under their belts, then move on to the third plural, and then the first singular. And don't move on to your next portion of the paradigm until the students have mastered the first form that you've introduced. Now, for some paradigms, you can cover multiple forms in one class session, especially for those of you, I know you're teaching in a 3-hour block. I'm not saying spend the entire 3-hour block on the third person singular. What I'm saying is you introduce the one in part of the class session, give the activities, master it, then move on to the next form. Master it before moving on to the next. So that would be presenting one thing at a time. The third example I'm going to bring in from Latin, which has a flexible word order. And because of that, it can be confusing especially for English speakers, where our word order is pretty fixed. So what you might want to do is to start with, again, if your students are native English speakers, start with standard word order in your language. For English, subject, verb, object. And when you're creating your Latin activities, make sure that the word order follows English word order, subject, verb, object. Then, once they've mastered that and they're good with whatever grammar vocabulary that you're teaching at the time, then start to switch up the word order a little bit. But when you do that, do not change vocabulary. Don't introduce new vocabulary. Do not introduce new grammar. Make sure you're not introducing anything else, and then switch it up. Maybe make it VSO or OVS or whatever it is you want to do, and start gradually changing that up so that they're starting to learn the new syntax of Latin. So that's another example of presenting one thing at a time. And this is part of the requirements of creating structured input activity. So by way of conclusion review here, we're talking about how to create structured input activities, and following the first guideline for doing that, you want to present one new thing at a time, which again is related to Creation's input hypothesis, which we've already covered a few weeks ago. This is the first of 6 guidelines that I'm going to unpack over the next few weeks, looking at how you might do this, and then we'll put it all together at the end. Keep in mind this is part of processing instruction, which is a way of manipulating input in such a way so that your students derive more intake for their processing, internal processing and acquisition than they might otherwise if you just randomly gave them some general input that's not as specifically focused. So the goal is to improve the quality, to derive more intake from the input, and to improve efficiency in language acquisition. So for next week, we will cover the second guideline, which is to keep meaning in focus. I hope you can join me for that episode. In the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.